Welcome. It has just gone past 7 p.m. Wednesday, the 28th of April, and you're watching episode 4 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates. Joining me on this episode is my guest, Joanne Rea. Joanne is a cattle producer and has been involved in the industry for more than 40 years. He is passionate about regional Queensland, its agriculture sector, and the welfare of its farming and grazing families. Joanne is a tireless advocate for the agriculture sector landowners, as they are continually burdened with seemingly unending stream of changing and new legislation and regulation. Welcome, Joanne.
Hello, Bill, and thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Joanne Rea. I'm presently the chair of Property Rights Australia. I've lived on this cattle property with my husband for the last 50 years. I've got a couple of children and a few grandchildren, all of whom are presently in Queensland, but it has not always been the case. I've always been fairly local to this area, except for a few years I spent away where I went to University of Queensland, St Lucia, and to Kelvin Grove Teachers Training College. I certainly am passionate about rural and regional Australia. I came into this industry from not a lot of experience with the country, and I just think they are treated so appallingly that a lot more people need to stand up and advocate on their behalf.
Well, I think regional Australia is really the fabric of the nation. We were founded basically on a rural industry culture. You know, we've benefited from off the sheets back in colonial times and later into the 20th century, and then we went into the wheat production, became a leading producer of wheat. Agriculture has always been a foundation of the nation, both export dollars and employment. You would say from the 50s onwards, when mechanisation came in, it changed in regards to the amount of labour you needed in rural places. So that started to change the communities, and also setting up of other industries in major port cities shifted the population. So we've undergone that change for the last 50 or 60 years. Now it seems to be very detrimental to regions and regional employment, and especially agriculture sector, and because there seems seemingly be a focus on service industries like education, fixing things, all that, and that sort of industry, and the focus has sort of really shifted away from agriculture and the things that actually count and we need on a daily basis.
Well, I think you're right, but I think COVID, if it did one thing, it showed that agriculture is reliable, steady, dependable, even in the face of something like COVID, along with mining to a degree, and all the other industries that are constantly touted by people who want our society to change, want more environmentalism, try to pass it off as increasing tourism. Tourism is a very shaky industry. Global financial crises and things like any sort of pandemic, terrorism even, just cuts tourism to the core, and we've seen that with COVID, whereas agriculture powers on and is a mainstay of the economy. And I think it's time that even people who want change need to recognise that. There are a lot of things that are just not correct that we're told out there, but you know, a lie told often enough becomes the truth.
Well, people get conditioned, I suppose. That's the thing, and unfortunately, the general public is fairly lazy in doing its own research, and so they will just generally feed off whatever's dished up on TV, or by some celebrity, and that's the gospel according to Hollywood or whatever's the fashionable show on TV these days. So that is a bit of a problem. But in regards to COVID, I wouldn't want this to happen too often, just to show how important agriculture is. I hope we don't have to deal with it much longer, or other pandemics in the near future. But we've got some way to go in this one.
Well, one of the notes I had written for myself actually was about scrutiny of environmental policy. And of all the policy areas in the country, environmental policy is one that is not open to a lot of scrutiny, a lot of fact checking, a lot of checking the science, and whoever has the loudest voice seems to prevail. And the science does not have a lot to do with it.
We'll sort of meet up on that topic a little bit later when we talk about the Veg Management Act. But you're right, because it seems like there's going to be a continual review of things that affect regional communities and that, because right now I think the next cab off the rank is the pig hunting. It seems to be on the cards because the RSPCA's pushed it, and if there's one thing that most farmers can't abide by is feral pigs, in their cane fields or in their crops, but the government seems to, well, maybe we sort of need to take care of the feral pigs sort of better. And it just seems ludicrous, but we can touch on that later. But if we can just come into Property Rights Australia in regards to its foundation, its general purpose, and some of the issues it's been dealing with, and what the other issues it's going to face in the future.
Well, the birth of property rights was with Vegetation Management Act, and the very first case that we ever ran was the case of Ashley McKay, who was tragically killed in a horse riding accident last week. He spent 6 horrendous years and 7 court cases, and eventually proved that he was innocent of the charges laid against him. He had properly made permits to clear the areas that he cleared, and they just pursued him relentlessly, as they did with other landowners. The government just decided that they wanted scalps on their belts and went to a tiny town like Charleville and had barristers and QCs that Charleville had never seen before. Most of the people had never been inside a courtroom before, and certainly not as the defendant in a criminal case. And the evidence that they brought forward was just extraordinary and not always honest. There are countless tales of not only inaccurate maps, but presenting wrong maps, incorrect maps, changing coordinates on maps. I mean, the state was and still is not a model litigator.
So that's basically the catalyst of forming the Property Rights Australia. So I'll just share the defendant in that case, and you can just give us a bit of an outline.
Vegetation Management Act.
Well,
oh, you want me to talk about? Yes,
yeah.
okay.
Well,
Doris and Ashley McKay, on the occasion of Ashley being presented with his OAM, which was a richly deserved honour. There are very, very few leaders in agriculture of the quality of Ashley. This is Ashley and his mare Elle in a camp draft.
Yep. And he's getting his AOM in the first shot.
In the first shot,
and this is his passion.
This is his passion, camp drafting.
And finally, just a picture of him.
This is Ashley presenting to our 2013 Property Rights Australia conference and going through the history of Property Rights Australia and some of the challenges that we'd faced, and they actually have not changed a lot. They are still the same. They are not improving. There are more things for us to deal with every single year. And I mean, now, as well as vegetation management, we get involved in mining and coal seam gas to try and even the playing field a little bit between landowners and the mining and coal seam gas companies. That's been a long road. We have made some progress, but we aren't there yet by a long, long way. Probably the environmental movement is the other player that we didn't have for a long time in agriculture, and they set their sights on destroying agriculture, forestry and fishing, and have largely succeeded with forestry and fishing. They're still working on agriculture. All of these laws, such as vegetation management and barrier reef laws, are all hugely influenced by the environmental movement and not always, as I said, based on sound science. In fact, I'm sure there are a lot of people out there in capital cities, in the general public, when they talk about destruction of the Great Barrier Reef, do not know that most of the accusations against agriculture are based on modelling, not on empirical science. None of the flows from the rivers, from the catchments, go anywhere near the Great Barrier Reef, which is usually 40 to 100 kilometres from the shore. And basically we've been just set up to take a fall. The Barrier Reef is not dead, and they have harmed tourism by claiming that it's dead. It's just another one of the fights that agriculture have to front up and do battle with.
I think one advantage you do have is if you go to the websites for the Australian Conservation Society or Foundation, I think it might be, and the Australian Marine Conservation, those two websites, I think you can read there what the proposed legislation for a couple of years' time will be that you have to face, because I'm sure the Vegetation Management Act or the intent of it actually comes from about a 2012 input onto the Australian Wildlife Conservation Society, and then the Reef Management Act was probably a bit later, and you got that on the Marine Conservation Foundation. So if you keep viewing them, you can see what's coming your way.
Well, yes, you can, and they're not shy in signalling what they want. However, they should not be able to get what they want without a compliant government and a compliant public. And the public who scrutinise everything else and take offence at everything else seem to believe everything that comes from these conservation organisations, and they should not. And no, they do signal very early what they're doing because they're coming from a safe place. But it's no good me knowing what they're doing if most of the rest of the population aren't aware that farmers have been subject to this long, relentless campaign to discredit them. Because discredit as they have.
Just moving back to the Property Rights Australia, can you give us a bit of an idea of your structure? Because I think you're you're not an incorporated body, but you're a privately limited, or so you have a board and that sort of structure. So that's it.
We are incorporated.
Yeah.
We're incorporated as a not-for-profit. We're membership based. We have a lot of members in Queensland, but not. We also have members in other states as well. People who just like what we're doing, what we stand for, and how we speak out on certain issues. We don't have any outside funding. Our funding all comes from our members, and a few law firms who have modestly sponsored us from time to time for our conferences and things like that. But we're beholden to nobody. We decide our own policy. We have a membership. We have a board usually consisting of somewhere between 5 and 7 members who are elected by members, and they basically like what we say. So our membership is very loyal.
Thanks for that. If we can just move on now to sort of some of the work you've been involved in and the processes that you are basically put before you by the government in regards to public inquiries, because that seems to be the way they appease the public by saying, well, we're going to consult and people have got to have input. So they have public inquiries. And like I was saying before, we've just recently, they've held the inquiry into the Burdekin Dam, which when it was originally put on the drawing board and built, there was already stage 2 design and approved and all the land set aside. That's never gone ahead, and it's being pushed for now. So where most people would have thought it was just a shovel-ready project because it's ticked all the boxes before, we've gone to now to a public inquiry. So maybe we won't get stage 2 that we thought we would get, and that seems popular. They come in, we've got to front up, we've got to talk to people, we've got to consult. We're not going to take any notice. It's like they come with cotton wool in their ears. So if you can just give us some of the idea in regards to some of the inquiries that you've contributed to.
Yes, well, I'll tell you what we do. Usually there's draft legislation put out for everyone to read, and we, along with a lot of the other organisations that are involved in a topic, put in a submission to the government, and some of them, like vegetation management, end up with hundreds and hundreds of submissions. Because
I think that was 772 public submissions. That's
exactly.
It must be a pretty well a record, I think.
I think it might have been, but it didn't help much. Because we're a unicameral system in Queensland and have only one House of Parliament, the parliamentary committee system and review of the legislation is supposed to be the substitute for a second house, because we do not in Queensland have a second house. And when it came to the last round of vegetation management, there was just an absolute mockery made of that system. The government started off, they had no intention of having any hearings outside Brisbane, and they only allowed for a very short amount of time in Brisbane. There was a huge outcry, so they decided that they'd have a few regional centres just to keep everybody a bit quiet, but they didn't allow sufficient time. They managed to squeeze in 2 in remote regional areas in a day. In far north Queensland, they had people who had come through floodwater with their children and camped under trucks for days to get there, and they were barely given a hearing. You know, one man took days to get there and was just pleading to be allowed to clear what was a very small percentage of his far north Queensland property so that he could plant fodder for his cattle, so that he didn't have to bring it in at great expense, where the freight was costing more than the hay or fodder itself. So all of these tragic stories never ever made any effect. And then after the hearings were over, as truncated as they were, Premier Palaszczuk and Chris Whiting, the chair of the committee, stood together and said that the grazing industry and the farming industry had presented no evidence. And the evidence we had presented was financial, legal, scientific, including that grass cover is often better than tree cover in preventing erosion, which is one of the things they were concerned about. They never signalled that what they wanted predominantly was something to do with the barrier reef. And of course, you know, it wasn't barrier reef legislation, it was vegetation management legislation. So why would you think that that was what they wanted to hear? And they just basically dismissed it. And the other point I'd like to make is that the public in southeast Queensland is totally unaware of the power held by the green organisations, because all of that sort of legislation is totally dominated by them, to the point where anyone who's familiar with the political system in Queensland knows, to the point where they say there will be no amendments. And if you read through Hansard, it's very clear that instead of having amendments put forward by the opposition as well, and some of them being accepted, all that were put forward as amendments were from the government and only to correct errors. So absolute mockery of our parliamentary system. And the same thing happened with the reef regulations. Sorry.
I'll just share a screen of some of the meetings that people attended in that era. These are just pictures of meetings held. So there always seemed to be a good attendance.
Absolutely. Longreach, I can see. The next one.
And the other one just down below there.
Charleville, is it?
No,
yes, Charleville.
Charleville in 2018.
Yeah. Do you have one at Gracemere Sale Yards?
I have one here of the stadium at Rockhampton.
Yes.
They're the ones I've just picked out from the actual document for the legislation, the review that they had. So I picked those three things. So it's just an indication that it's not as though people weren't willing to participate. They were out there in droves, basically, and eager to participate and put their information. And by the sheer numbers, 772 public submission is a good swag. To say you didn't present evidence is a bit worrying. But as you
Absolutely.
say, with a unicameral parliament, you can't really expect. Government of the day will get its way regardless, and that's just the nature of the beast. And I mean, some people have called for the reinstatement. I think Pauline Hanson's called for the reinstatement of the upper house, but I don't see that. I haven't seen the LNP really push for anything like that, so I think we're just stuck with the unicameral situation forever in Queensland. There's certainly no push anywhere to change that situation that happened basically in 1922, 1923, where the upper house was abolished, and actually the referendum said no. The people didn't want it abolished, but the Labor Party of the day, the people in the upper house, fell on their swords and abolished themselves. So that's the situation we've inherited, and it doesn't look like something that's going to change anytime soon, because there just hasn't seen any action to rectify that situation. So we'll remain the only state parliament with a single house.
I think you could be right there.
Just moving on to some of the evidence in that. So in regards, as you say, a lot of things are now driven by modelling, from a particular scientific community that's got sway, and empirical evidence doesn't seem to come into it. And also, the worst thing is actual physical evidence. Like if you go and show them a picture of something in 1980 where it had been mined over or in some sort of condition, and then someone's done something positive in your normal management of their own land, that doesn't come to it in it. Even if you've got photographic evidence, this is what it's like before, and it was in bad condition, and this is what I've done. I've thinned vegetation, I've changed the water course, and here it is all nice and green and grassy and that. That doesn't even seem to count, because one of the people who gave a reasonable bit of evidence in that submission was Bill Burrows, and his submission showed documented evidence all the way through of time lapse shot between, say, 5 years ago and what it was after intervention by caring land managers and the improvement in it, but that still didn't seem to take any sway.
Well, I'll briefly touch on the campaign, and I don't think the environmental business is in the business of looking at evidence unless it supports what they want. I don't think they're interested in good outcomes. I think they're interested in agendas. And what they said for the tree clearing in particular was, you know, erosion, soil erosion going to the Great Barrier Reef, loss of biodiversity, all of those sorts of things, disconnection of habitat. They had a whole litany of it. And none of it really was honest, in that the original Vegetation Management Act was actually called for by Canberra in order to help them meet their greenhouse gas commitments. And the agricultural community were totally ignorant of that reason for the vegetation laws for a very long time. And it took a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of work on the part of a fellow called Peter Spencer to really bring all this out into the open, so that we got the whole history of why the Vegetation Management Act was brought in. And it was brought in by the federal government blackmailing the states so that they wouldn't have to pay fair and just compensation, which is called for under the Constitution. And the Green Movement helped out enormously by coming up with all these environmental reasons, many of which have proven not to be correct, but they won't admit that they're not correct. And Bill Burrows, you know, they're talking about greenhouse gases. Bill Burrows outlines in his submission at least 3 different methods with many empirical evidence points. One is a carbon dating method, one's a satellite method, and one's an on-ground measuring method. And all of them, over, as I mentioned, many points, all of them have come to the conclusion that there's been an increase in woody biomass across Australia of 1,000 to 1,200 kilograms per hectare per year for the last 100 to 150 years. So there is absolutely no evidence at all that the amount of woody biomass in Australia is decreasing. It has been increasing ever since white settlement and doing away with cultural burning.
Well, just on that point, it's the woody mass, and sometimes it's not beneficial in regards to our situation, because a lot of that woody mass is just sort of striplings and basically growth, sucking the goodness out of the soil, dropping leaf matter, especially gum leaf matter, that sort of anhydrous denies water the ability to soak in, and has a poor impact on grasses. You know, my brother-in-law, he's in the instant turf business, and if there's one thing he hates with a vengeance, is gum trees, because they suck the life out of grasses simply on their nutrient and water usage. And then the leaf cover is usually detrimental to the grass coverage as well. And this fixation with trees, rather than the overall what's a good environment, seems to have been counterproductive, because if there's one thing that helps prevent erosion, it's grass, not trees. Trees, if you go across the Nullarbor Plain or drive between Coolgardie and Perth, I come from Western Australia, get out of your car and walk off the road where this vegetation is, this very spindly looking gum trees, walk on the ground and all it is gravel. There's no topsoil. Leaf matter's never composted to do anything good with the soil. And so any time of rain, of course you're going to get runoff and erosion. So tree matter doesn't always necessarily improve the environment, especially when I understand on hillsides, trees are great. They hold the hillsides together. But when it comes to a plain, it's the grasses that hold the soil together, and they're more important. Fewer trees, more grass, and trees with a chance of actually maturing to a reasonable size and good growth, rather than thousands of little spindly bushes, is a much better situation. But it doesn't. They'd rather have just heaps of woody trees, and rather than actual good environment, useful environment.
Well, it really is a bit of a puzzle, and you're correct that grass is in most situations better at preventing erosion, but we had countless numbers of landowners and grassland scientists and woodland scientists who have presented that evidence to many parliamentary inquiries, and the green organisations do not want to know. They have their own agenda, and what really is the truth and not the truth is not always the most important consideration.
Especially if you've got an agenda.
They've got an agenda, exactly. And the agenda is not about preventing erosion. There is something else there.
I'll just show us a screenshot from Bill Burrows' I'll get it done. No, I didn't get it. I'll have to go to his other document. Sorry about that.
Well, there is one out of Bill's submission that I really like a lot, and it's a series of graphs taken in mulga country showing that once you get past about 20% basal stem area, the pasture is zero. And it goes down to zero really quickly. It's an exponential negative effect down to zero pasture. And in the last round of vegetation management, people were forced to conserve 60% of their permitted area for fodder harvesting. And all that means is that you get really thick regrowth, and there is no pasture and no biodiversity, no kangaroos, nothing. I'm told that ants are all that live in there. So what sort of an environmental outcome is that?
Well, that's not important to the people in the city, is it?
Well,
and with agenda.
You know, they've been sold the idea that trees are important. So a mulga tree's a tree, and it doesn't matter if it kills every piece of grass underneath it. They don't know because they're told otherwise. And the other thing that's happening, and Bill presents this very well as well, is open grasslands being encroached upon by forest. And the green movement are always fond of talking about loss of biodiversity. Well, some of that biodiversity includes granivorous birds and small marsupials, and they depend on grassland, not trees, grasslands. So the trees are detrimental to them. But no environmental group ever draws those threads together. They just say agriculture's to blame for loss of biodiversity, and it just is not true.
Okay, I'll just show some of Bill's shots now.
Yes.
I've got to get right. This is Cypress pine invasion. So you've got an old shot, 1936 to 89. So you can see fairly healthy gum tree, spotted gum, and it's deteriorated over time because of the invasion by it's spaced by cypress pines, and they're basically battling for the water and the nutrients in the ground. So both species are going to suffer, but obviously the cypress pine does the most damage. The other one here is the thickening of woodlands around the Burdekin. So so we can see that the ironbarks are sort of being replaced over time with other types of plants.
Yes, more stems per hectare.
Yeah. So that's the situation, and I also notice it's a bugbear up on the Cape in regards to the regrowth. That not only does it affect the grass and reduce the amount of cattle you can graze, but I can't imagine sometimes how any cow or any cattle can move through some of those areas because the striplings are so dense and there's not much grass there anyway. So it becomes harder and harder to actually be productive in those areas now if you can't remove some of that regrowth.
Absolutely, and you know, impossible to muster. You can't move through the area at all. So not only is it less productive, it's impossible to manage as well. So they're just condemned to more and more thickening. And the other thing about thickening and the attitude of governments to national parks is the lock up and leave philosophy, where they just declare an area a national park, lock it up, don't manage it, and it becomes a haven for feral animals and exotic weeds and a fire hazard. And I don't know how the environment movement or the environment business can justify talking about planting eucalypts and restoring habitat from the fires. All the habitat for the fires will grow back, but we don't need more of it. We don't need it more connected. That was why the fires were as bad as they were. There were no disconnected areas where people could regroup and try to get them under control. And the lock up and leave philosophy of national parks is just going to lead to more of all of the above: feral animals, weeds and fire. And national parks are the worst neighbours that people have.
I'll just share a picture of that mulga.
Yes.
Did I get that wrong one? Sorry. There you go. Yeah. Mulga invasion of grasslands.
This is one of the ones I think of among Bill's photographs that is the most stunning.
So can you give us a bit of a rundown of what we're looking at in those three shots?
Over in the top left-hand corner, we're looking at a photograph from 1957. And as you can see in the background, there's a bit of open woodland, not very many trees at all. You can tell that it is exactly the same photograph in 1994. You can see that there's a lot of vegetation just outside the garden, and then in 2001 there's even more. You can see trees as far as the whole horizon. So a very descriptive set of photographs, that one. But
so in regards to that growth that's out there, it's not overly beneficial to the environment, or is that what you're sort of suggesting, that is an invasion of the mulga, is it?
Well, yes, I think so. I mean, that sort of thickness and of trees was not what was here when Australia was settled. It was open forest, as in the first picture in 1957. That's closer to what it was. And in fact, some of those look like fairly small trees, so they were probably fairly recently there too as well. I mean, the number of trees per hectare has gone from an estimated 20 trees per hectare to somewhere up around the thousands, 2,500 per hectare or something. So this is not what was here. It's not what supported the biodiversity that was here when European settlers arrived. It is not what will support the biodiversity that is even there now if it's allowed to thicken up even more.
Because basically what that's doing is destroying, although it looks nice in green canopy cover type thing, but it's below it on the ground level that's the problem.
Yeah, not a blade of grass to be seen.
Even rabbits would have a hard time finding a feed out there.
Absolutely.
So if the basically native animals can't get a foothold in those sort of, or forced out of those environments, it's one animal disappears, then another animal disappears, and another, and birds and that, because they need all that interaction to sustain themselves, and basically their whole environment's been shut down by this high growth of woodlands.
Yes, I'm assured by locals in the mulga country that not kangaroos, not snakes, not anything can operate in that really thick mulga.
You see the problem with that photo, but to a person in the city, if they looked at one shot, like the 57 or the 94 shot, and they look at that, and then they look at the 2001 and they see all that green, they think, oh, that looks good, that's an improvement, that's what we want. They don't, because they don't know anything about the research and the impact of that greening and what it's doing to the fauna, and also what it's also doing to the flora in regards to seeding plants and things like that. It's robbing them of their environment to get a start in life. So that's probably the problem in regards to imaging. A bit of greenery is wonderful, but they don't understand the greenery kills biodiversity. See,
I don't see it like that at all. I see all those thick trees and no grass underneath, and that's a horror for me. So yeah, it's merely what people have been schooled to think.
And so it boils down to education. I think Martin Bella sort of suggested that we need to re-educate the people in the southeast or in the cities and that. But A, I don't know if they're that interested, and B, they're going to be bombarded by other stuff. So it might be a bit hard to re-educate people unless you actually live in the regions and then are connected to the land. A lot of people don't get the whole picture. Like we had Sean Jackson on from Lakelands last week, and it's like talking to the bureaucracy and other people outside the region. It's like just talking to a brick wall. They just think everything should be green. They don't understand, well, this bit of land's just bare. It's got nothing on it. Yeah, but it's productive. It's going to grow pumpkins, or it's going to grow some vegetable or whatever. And that's just the nature of the land. You need water, land, and nutrients to grow a crop. And they see if it doesn't have 100 trees on it, well, it's useless. And that is really, really a problem. And I don't know how we are going to address it, because through what they learn at schools and the general media and that, it's all about green and trees, and nothing else seems to matter. And I think if there's trees, that's utopia. Everything lives with the trees and that. But as you say, it's not true. The trees denude the ground level in a lot of cases, especially in Australia. So that's the problem we've got to try to push along. But I don't know really how we're going to change those attitudes. And the thing is, it doesn't seem that our politicians are smart enough to recognise wheat from the chaff, if you know what I mean, in regards to what's presented to them. And not only, maybe not even interested in a lot of cases, and that's really a problem.
Well, it's extraordinary to me that the general city population, who are so meticulous about being critical of policy of all different types, are so non-discerning when it comes to environmental policy. They get all their environmental policy from the same sorts of groups. And if I may, there's one point I'd like to make before we go, and that is, it upsets us hugely that people walk around in cities and say, we as a country have done nothing for climate change policy. That just is not true. The last 30 years of unmanaged vegetation has been our climate policy, and a study by the Australian the Australian Farm Institute shows that the only sector to reduce emissions has been the agricultural sector, and every other sector has merrily gone on its way increasing emissions. So as a country, yes, we have been decreasing emissions, and it's all been done by agriculture. And all the politicians who say we shouldn't carve agriculture out, we shouldn't give agriculture a free pass or a free ride by cutting them out of climate policy, do not know what they are saying.
I can just add to that in regards to, we'll just go into the lockup of land and that. There is a movement to put more land up into national parks and lock it away. We've got two things happening. We've got private groups, individuals even, and also from the Conservation Society, buying up land, and it's been noticeable on the peninsula in particular, buying up land there that was available, locking it down, and then we've also had individuals do that who have, fairly well off, and now you have state governments actually adopting a policy to capture more land and put it under national parks. One of the big problems with that is it's all very well having land and putting it into national parks, but if you're not prepared to manage it, well, then you're just adding to a big problem. Twofold. If we have got a heap of forest and vegetated areas under national parks, and it seems that the only thing that we do with them is lock them up and let them grow old, and they either fall down, rot and decay, which releases methane, which is 20 times more potent than CO2, or we just let it become fuel for a forest fire, which gives us the CO2 off. But we've got the wise thing is harvest a good percentage of that wood before it dies, store it as carbon in your buildings or furniture or whatever, because I don't know if you've been to Europe, but if you go to Europe, you can sit in places like Munich at the gates of the city, and there's buildings there, and you can see the timber frames. That timber has been there for 700 years. So it will stay around if you look after it. And isn't that the greatest bit of carbon capture we can have, rather than just let it either decay and become methane, or let it burn and become CO2? It doesn't seem logical that we have an asset like forests, we don't capture the carbon when it's most useful.
Well, the forest industry is another one of the ones that's under threat, and any little patches that we have left, the environmental business are trying to get rid of, particularly native forestry. So, you know, all the environmental protections that are put in place in order to carry that out are not valued. Their ability and the fact that they have the machinery and the knowledge to deal with bushfires is not valued. And the firefighter foresters are ignored, while the academics who write about forestry from behind a desk are the ones who seem to prevail. And it seems to be all the way through our society at the moment.
I think there's a general problem is that the people who have got the greatest input into that sort of decision making in the public servants are located down in either Canberra or Sydney or Brisbane in nice air-conditioned offices in a concrete jungle, whereas really they need to pick up, put in a sort of portable cabin somewhere on the peninsula or out at Longreach or somewhere, and made to stay there for 6 months and say, well, here's a bit of land, do what you can to improve it. Now, learn something from the people around, and then tell us what you really think should be done now. But if it's all academic sort of stuff, and like you say, the problem is modelling. Everything is down to modelling, like what you've referred to in the reef. You know, they can't, because they can't actually measure pesticides or fertilisers on the reef because it's too small. They simply measure it in the streams inland, the outlets maybe, and then extrapolate through their models how much is getting to the reef and how much damage it's done. So it seems that we really need a system where these people are actually dragged out of those environments in those major cities and sit in the environments that they're supposed to care and manage about, because it seems to be a problem. And especially Canberra now, we're looking at probably at least third and fourth generation public servants. You know, granddad was in the Canberra bureaucracy, dad, and their expectation is that their kids will go to the university in Canberra, the National University, Australian National University or something like that, and then get a job in the public service. So you're dealing with a population, Canberra's population, the ATC is now 450,000 or so. So you get these people who are in that closed environment and they don't have any other real outlook, and that's where a lot of our policies got to come from. I don't know how we're going to change it, and it's especially if our representatives in our region don't have the impact when they actually get to Canberra or Brisbane, because that seems to be a real problem, especially North and Central Queensland. I think we've got 17 seats in the Queensland Parliament, and that's still a reasonable number. It's not as much as we had in the old days of malapportionment before we went back to one vote, one value, when we had about 42 or 43 regional seats in an 82 seat parliament. But now it's even more critical that the people who have represented us in parliament, whether we can actually grab them by the scruff of the neck, the ones in Cairns and Townsville, and take them out and sit them in the bush and that, and say, well, you know, you're supposed to be looking after our interests as a whole for the state. These are the facts. You know, fight for us in Brisbane against the bureaucracy, at least. So is representation really something we've got to sort of look at to sort of ensure that we do get a voice in these sort of things in the future?
Well, we do have some good ones. I mean, the Senate inquiry into the Great Barrier Reef, we had some wonderful senators, and they were able to show that there really was not a lot of evidence that agriculture was harming the Great Barrier Reef. And you're talking about fertiliser and pesticides. They can't even actually measure very much of it when they come right back to the catchments. So they kept getting further and further away from the Great Barrier Reef and closer to the shore. And they actually ended up in the catchments rather than on the Great Barrier Reef.
Well, here's another interesting. I mean, I've just got a normal residential property, but I'd be probably one of the biggest users of herbicides to kill the weeds around the place, and then multiply that by all the households in cans. I reckon we'd go through a few litres every month controlling the weeds in our domestic situation. So that's fine, but they seem to sort of go overboard on farmers in regards to, well, you don't want to spend any more money than you have to. Herbicides cost money, fertilizers cost money, it all hurts your bottom line. So you got to do the minimum you can to make sure you your productivity. So it's maybe they should just look at normal households and start getting on us a little bit and leave news alone, because at least you produce something. All I do is kill weeds.
I tell all my friends in town that they should get the mattock out and dig the weeds out, and they wouldn't need to go to the gym every day.
I'm not so the way the weeds grow now. I just can't. I mean, I came from Melbourne up to here, and I just can't get over how things just grow. So, like a couple of months ago, I was clearing back of my block. It's got a big hill. Ripped down the weeds and just threw them on the lawn. And I just thought, well, I'll leave them there until I have enough to load the ute and take them away. Anyway, about 3 weeks later, I decided to put it on the ute. It actually rooted back into the ground on the lawn, and I actually have to pull it out of the lawn. So that's how things just grow here. And so I can't see, and I don't think a mattock would help that much because there's just so many of them anyway. So no, I'm a big user of Roundup, I'm afraid.
Fair enough.
Well, is there any other points you want to really wrap up on to maybe just touch on? One thing I'm sort of noticed in the paper recently and on the website was the buying of a property in Western New South Wales, some 157,000 hectare property. That's a fair chunk of land. Obviously, it suffered a downturn through the droughts that they've experienced. So, and like unfortunately, a lot of owners these days of rural properties, they're going on in age, and also haven't managed to retain either their children on the property or to take it over. So it leaves a lot of property up in the air. And I presume a lot of these properties in the future, without a succession plan, will probably come onto the market. And if there's not enough interest, well, the price won't be there. And it's just an opportunity for either the government to snap up or someone to snap up and put into lockdown. So have you got a bit of a comment like that? Well, I just show this photo of the New South Wales property.
Okay, well, that is a possible scenario, but we also need to keep in mind that if the government actually wants somewhere for a national park, they have the power to take it over anyway. And you spoke before about privately owned national parks. I've already said national parks are the worst neighbours. Now, the idea that we have privately owned ones, that was pitched by the government at overseas groups as well as Australian groups, or predominantly Australian groups. And whether it's a disaster or not will depend entirely on the management and whether they manage it and manage it well, or whether they don't manage it at all. Or in some cases, I suspect and predict that they do things that are illegal to do on any private property.
I've just got the photo up there on the screen for the audience. This is out in Western New South Wales. Is that that's sort of the rundown of the Darling River area, or is it a bit further out? Or was that similar to our Channel country as well?
Well, it's obviously a swampy area which they want to preserve, and the environmental groups talk about wetlands and swamplands being important. They are also, we need to recognise, a source of methane, so there's a little bit of a hypocritical philosophy there. I don't think they're like our Channel country. I actually think our Channel country is unique and not anything that we come across anywhere else.
Just in regards to the Murray-Darling Basin, I mean that's more to do with the southwest of Queensland running into northern New South Wales. One of the things I sort of never really got in regards to the Murray Basin Commission and Plan and one of the reasons it came about was the requirement, or one of the sing-songs about it was, I think it's the Coorong Lakes in South Australia, keeping the water supply down the Murray for the red gums and then down to the Coorong for the wildlife there. But it seems to me if you're creating an environment by using barrages to hold back the tidal water so you could turn it into a freshwater thing, isn't that non-environmental, if you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean, and I do think it's a tragedy that the Murray-Darling Basin Association won't acknowledge that it was formerly an estuary, and all the water that they run down there is not a natural flow. They keep the water flowing down there, even in times where in nature it would be sparse to nothing. And the red gums are used to being intermittently flooded, not entirely flooded. And the speed of the flows cause erosion. It destroys platypus habitat. It destroys waterbird nests that nest on the edge of the river. I mean, the environmental damage caused by these so-called environmental flows is huge.
Well, that's one of the things. I mean, if your starting point is we've got to preserve a man-made artificial environment, that's completely logical. And as a starting point, we've got to preserve this by changing or protecting the requirements on the environment further upstream, so we can keep this artificial thing. So it just beggars belief. That's even in the equation.
There are a lot of problems with the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, but it's not one of my areas of expertise, so I've probably exhausted my knowledge on it now.
But it's just an interesting topic for everyone in agriculture, because water is such an important part. Even in North and Central Queensland, we always sort of, let's face it, water is life, and if we can put more water there, it has to be better. I mean, being without it. So that's sort of one thing. But we still don't seem to be able to get dams built and irrigation things running for us.
No, we do not. And you were talking about the Coorong. I mean, Dr. Jennifer Marahassi's been under fire from the ABC for claiming it was an estuary, and they're sort of implying that perhaps she's got some sort of a vested interest. I mean, I've seen her interest in the Coorong for a very long time, and I think it's just a scientific reality for her, and I find that approach fairly distressing myself.
And I think she's also involved in some of our reef science as well.
Yes.
Input there along with Peter Reid, and Peter Reid has his final day in court in the next. I'm not sure, in a couple of weeks or within a couple of weeks.
June,
yeah.
It's June.
So that's on the cards, and that'd be interesting. In regards to what if there's going to be hopefully a new standard in regard. Hopefully it comes out of it that he wins the case, and we get some sort of new standard of evidence. Like you say, we want empirical evidence. We don't want models. We want real data, and we want it to be all in the open, because especially so much of the research in that is funded by the public. Surely it's automatic that it should be available to every Australian if they want to have a look at it, and the people who put it up there has to be answerable for methods and their final summaries in regards to what they put there, and then also be subject to review, independent review, and that's one of the
independent review. That is the key phrase, because there's just so many vested interests around the place that really are interested in getting more funding and, you know, keeping a lot of people and a lot of groups happy rather than looking at the evidence.
Well, I mean, just as agriculture is an industry, scientific research is an industry. However, your industry depends on you working and producing to get money. Their industry depends on how much they can sort of encourage the government to open the purse strings. And the thing that opens the purse strings in most cases is panic or doomsdayism or situations that have to be corrected. And when we found this, we're not looking to solve it. We're just seeing what other problems we need to investigate it. Like the last thing that people in research do is want to find the solution. They just want to find the next pathway to research.
That's why all science that is used as any basis for legislation should be open to independent scrutiny.
Exactly. It should be there for everyone to look at. It doesn't matter if you're just a lay person, but it should definitely be open to counter views where they can sort of put up other side to the story. But I think one of the most interesting things, I don't know if you ever come across it, but the 1959, actually it was 1960 speech, farewell speech by President Eisenhower in the United States. And he was one of the first persons who basically warned of this group think and research system, where he referred to, we used to be a nation of tinkerers in our garages and come up with inventions. But I have a fear now that the way we've consolidated this into a bigger pool of researchers, all with access to government money, we're probably going to let ourselves down. And that was in 1960. So that was a great speech of someone who foresaw, even in the short time that industry after the war had been around, and seen what it had developed into. I suppose his outlook was basically he saw what was growing in the military industry, in regards to what the supplies were, and the groupthink and the less and less of small operators contributing, and you just get bigger pool. At that time, it was a few different pools putting input into industry, and then today it's just turned into a few big conglomerates. So, and we're missing that spread from right across your public sort of thing input. We've been going for a bit over an hour, so if you'd just like to wrap up your thoughts in regards to what's next on the plate for you and your organisation, and what support you're looking for in regards to people, the public, and of course your members.
Well, what we need is the general public to scrutinise environmental policy a little more carefully. We need an Office of Scientific Review so that science used for legislation is reviewed by an independent panel. We need legislation that is fair, evidence-based and scientifically grounded, and not something that's just put out there to suit somebody's agenda. So I really think that sums it up in a nutshell. Vegetation's always on the cards. The barrier reef legislation is something that will unfold, and depending on how it's handled, it could be done subtly and scientifically, or it can be done in a way that is heavy-handed and destructive.
Okay, Jenna, we'll wrap it up there for the night. Thanks very much for your participation. If you could just stay online, and I'll just wrap up the episode and announce next week's show, and then we'll just have a chat after. Thank you for joining us tonight. Next week, we have Shane Condon from Project Iron Boomerang. It's now more important than ever Australia gets back on its feet in regards to having secondary industries, especially in steel making and any other industry where we can use our own resources and add value. Project Iron Boomerang is a great project for the nation. It's great for our strategic values and use of resources, and also allows us to get into a competitive market. So next week, join me with Shane Condon and the Iron Boomerang project. If you enjoyed the show, please like, share, and follow. And if you're following on YouTube, please follow and subscribe. Thanks very much for your attention, and we'll see you again next week.